Hello, I'm Mark Webb from the Medieval Coventry charity, and I'm here today to give a brief talk on the Coventry medieval ceremonial sword, which has been brought over from the Burrell collection in Glasgow. And there's a possibility that this is the first time the medieval sword has been in the city for perhaps even as long as 500 years. So it's quite an exciting occasion, and it's worth examining the sword and its history in detail. So first of all, what is a ceremonial sword? This isn't a military sword. This is one that was used in ceremonies, for example, the election of the mayor, or if the king happened to be visiting in Coventry. And a civic sword is actually a representation of royal power. So it actually represents the king when he's absent. It's a symbol also of the city's rights and privileges, which were very jealously guarded, and only a certain number of cities were allowed to have a sword that was, they were gifted by the king. The city had to have a particular significance, and Coventry in the late medieval period was actually the fourth largest city in the country, very important, seat of royal power for a period during the period of the Wars of the Roses. And the capital of the Midlands. So I think it's worth having a quick look at the sword in detail. So the camera is now going to be focusing on, you'll notice that we don't have the complete sword, we have the hilt. The fraction of the blade is a later addition, but the hilt is original, and the detail actually tells us a little bit about Coventry's role in the Wars of the Roses, which are the dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York in the second half of the 15th century. So if we have a look at the pommel, which we're focusing on at the moment, you'll see there there's a medallion. Now it's very difficult to see at the moment because it's upside down. The sword was meant to be carried with the blade facing upwards, but that isn't actually the upside down image of the elephant and castle, which, as we all know, is the symbol of the city as it was in the medieval times. On the reverse side would have been the royal arms. And we happen to know that this sword was actually gifted in the 1460s because if we look at the guard just above the blade, you can see there alternating roses and a sun. Now that is the sun called the Sun in Splendour, which was the personal badge of Edward IV, who became king in 1461. He was a Yorkist king, so that has enabled us to date this sword to around about 1461. It would have been given by the king to replace an earlier sword, which would have been a Lancastrian sword, which I'll talk about more later on. So the grip is made of ivory. So it's a very rare sword, also because of the typology. The shape of the sword is quite unusual, which I'll go on to in a moment. So the history of the sword, well, ceremonial swords, as I mentioned, were given to kings to important cities from the 14th century. And we've actually got a record of one of the early swords given to Coventry by Richard II in the 1380s. It's the first record of any civic sword, ceremonial sword given to any city outside London. So it just shows how Coventry was in that period. This is not the original sword. This is not the Richard II sword. This is probably the second or third sword in its series. They were replaced quite regularly as new kings came to the throne. But Coventry was recognised more as a Lancastrian city. It was the favourite city of King Henry VI and his Queen Margaret of Anjou. In fact, they made Coventry its headquarters in the period around about 1456 to 1460, just before this sword was made. And of course, everybody will know about the tapestry, the wonderful tapestry in St Mary's Hall. That depicts Henry VI of Margaret of Anjou, who really favoured Coventry, and in fact, in 1451 made Coventry its own county, which gave the civic sword even more significance. The sword is also mentioned in the Leet book, which is in the Coventry archives, which is an account of the regulations and important events that are happening in the city at the time. And there's a really interesting reference to the civic sword in the Leet book. In 1457, when Margaret of Anjou and the King, Henry VI, were based in Coventry, Henry was unwell. He has suffered a mental breakdown. So Margaret took over the levers of power and guarded her young son, only 3 years old, Edward, Prince of Wales. They were all based here in Coventry. And in 1457, the Leet book tells us that Margaret of Anjou was leaving Coventry briefly to go to a visit to Coleshill. And she insisted on having this sword put in front of her, borne in front of her. Now, the mayor objected because civic swords were only supposed to be borne in front of the king or the mayor, not the queen or any other members of the royal family. So the Leet book is full of the indignation of the mayor, the fact that Margaret of Anjou assumed this very sacred and important responsibility of having the sword in front of her. 4 years later, Edward VI became king, as I mentioned before. So this sword dates from 1461 when he came to the throne. But another reason why this is important in telling the story of Coventry's vital role in the Wars of the Roses is that the Wars of the Roses didn't end there. They carried on, or they resumed about 10 years later. Warwick the Kingmaker, who put Edward IV on the throne, changed sides, went to the Lancastrian side, and actually brought Henry back and put him on the throne, which led Edward to go into exile and then invaded. And in 1471, he actually appeared at the gates of Coventry with his army, and Warwick the Kingmaker and his army inside the walls refused him entry. So naturally, Edward was furious about this. And then when, after the Battle of Barnet, which he won, he became king again for the second time in 1471. He didn't forget the fact that Coventry had shut him out. So he confiscated the sword, this very sword. He took it back to London and he confiscated Coventry's liberties, including its county status. And Coventry was forced to plead to him and swear an oath of allegiance, pay a massive fine, very expensive fine, and then the sword was restored. So this sword actually plays a very important part in Coventry's history, but also national events. So how did the sword end up in a Glasgow museum? Well, in the Coventry archives, there's an inventory of the Coventry regalia, which includes the mace and the chain of office. And there were 3 swords mentioned. So this possibly was still in Coventry at that time. We can't be sure. But what we do know is that in 1897, it ended up in a rubbish heap in Whitechapel in London. Goodness knows how it ended up in a rubbish heap. But fortunately, an expert picked it up, identified it, saw that the Elephant and Castle connected it with Coventry. And the expert was somebody called Sir Guy Laking, and he produced a 5-volume book on European medieval arms and armour. It was published in 1920. He bought the sword, described it in his book, and then it came back to national prominence. The sword was then later sold to Sir William Burrell, a Glasgow shipping magnate, an art collector. He had an enormous collection of medieval artifacts, and he took an interest in the Coventry sword. And then when he died in 1944, he donated his entire collection to the city of Glasgow. So that's why it ended up in the Burrell collection in Glasgow. So there's another reason why this sword is important, because it's connected with Coventry's constitutional arrangements. Or before I go on to that, I should talk about the style of the sword, which is quite unusual. So you've probably seen from the close-ups, the heart-shaped pommel, which is very, very rare. And if we can scroll up onto the interpretation panel, you can see there we've got two images of very similar swords. So the one that's the lady there that is St. Barbara from a crucifixion scene at Bruges Cathedral. So it's very, very similar heart-shaped pommel with the guard, with the ends turning down, just like the Coventry sword. And that's dated to the first quarter of the 15th century. So a little bit earlier than our sword. And then if we look at the other depiction on the other side, in Canterbury Cathedral, we've got the tomb, the Beaufort tomb, a Lancastrian family, very important in 15th century England. And you can see right beside the tomb there, a very similar pommel or fishtail shaped pommel. That one hasn't got the guard turning down, but the pommel is very similar. There is one other depiction. It's actually got a surviving sword in Hereford that's very similar to our Coventry sword. So yes, going back to another reason why it's important and the connection with Coventry's constitutional arrangements, Coventry's got some of the oldest governance in the country. In 1345, Edward III gave it a charter of incorporation, which allowed Coventry to govern itself with minimal royal interference. And that included the right to elect a mayor annually. So the ceremonial sword in the later 14th century became part of that ceremony. It's also associated with the guild system in Coventry and the apprenticeship system, which led to freedom of the city. So 14th century guilds or trade associations with a strong religious purpose were very strong in Coventry. The famous Trinity Guild, formed in 1392, had international and royal connections. And the guilds regulated the length and terms of apprenticeships, for example, in the wool and cloth industries. But after somebody had finished their apprenticeship, after 5 or 7 years, they had to swear an oath of allegiance to the crown, and then the apprentice became a freeman of the city, and that allowed a number of privileges, including the freedom to trade without toll, but also to graze their livestock on the common ground, places that still exist today, like Hersal Common. The Freemen's Guild was revived in 1946. And at the annual installation of the Master, the ceremony in St Mary's Hall, where they revived the old 16th century ceremony, they use a different civic sword for that occasion. So there is a strong connection there between ceremonial swords, Coventry's guilds, apprenticeship ceremonies, and a continuation right to today from the medieval period. So I think I've talked enough now. There's more I can say, but I wondered if now we've got no more questions. What I can say is that there is another medieval sword in the Lord Mayor's office, slightly earlier than this one, about 20 years older. I've just been inspecting that. That was probably used for a different purpose. It's not unusual for a major city to have two medieval swords, but this one was definitely connected with royalty. We've seen the royal symbol of Edward IV there, so it has a particular significance. Other cities that have got swords include Hereford, Dublin, Bristol, Chester, Hull and Gloucester, and we know there are a record that by about 1500 17 towns were granted swords, but Coventry was one of the very, very earliest. So do come and have a look at the sword. It's in the medieval gallery of the Herbert Art Gallery and Museum. It's available on loan until the 21st of November. It's well worth looking and having a very close look at because there's a lot of interesting detail. and put in the context of the medieval gallery and interesting information about its trade and governance, it's quite a rare opportunity to see this in context.